Hello, everybody. Welcome and thank you for joining us. This is our National Quilters Circle live Q&A. And today we're with Colleen Tauke. She's here to chat all things quilting, and we would love for you to please send all of your questions for Colleen into the chat box below. You can try it out right now. Just pop something in that says hello, where you're viewing from, and keep your questions handy because that's where I will be checking for the entirety of today's Q&A session to ask Colleen as many questions as we can get to. And that said, my name is Leah, so if you haven't joined me for a live Q&A before, I moderate a lot of these. They're a ton of fun, and I'm really excited for today's. A couple things that I want to bring to your attention before we bring Colleen on into those Q&As. We are focusing on color theory this month, and we have a free download for you. There's going to be a link coming into the chat box for you to download our PDF, Quilting Color Theory, how to choose the best colors for your quilts. I know that we have a lot of questions on colors every time that I do one of these quilting things, so I hope that that PDF is helpful. Go ahead and download yours. And that brings me to Colleen, our guest. Colleen, I have heard that you are great with color theory. Before we dig in with your thoughts on that, I'd love for you to just say how things have been going. Hello, welcome.
Hi, haven't seen you in a while. It's nice to see you. And
You
it's
too.
wonderful that all of our quilters can join us to learn more about color. I've been working on a lot of small projects for National Quilters Circle Live, and some of those have crossed over to Craftsy. So it's been kind of fun to create small projects that are kind of a little bit of a break from doing our monster projects that we get ourselves involved in. And sometimes we just need a little break from those projects to do something small and something quick. And those are what I've been focusing on lately. So
Great. Well, before I open it up to questions for our viewers, I would love if you would just give us some beginning thoughts on color theory, things, a jumping off point, anything that you would want to share with the viewers before we get into their questions. The floor is yours.
Okay. When it comes to color, that is probably the area that most quilters find as the most difficult. They can learn their cutting and measuring and piecing skills, but the color sometimes becomes a huge challenge. The biggest thing I think is to keep going. If it doesn't work the first time, it's a quilt. It can be loved and used. Go on to the next quilt. Read as much as you can. The PDF that you can download here today will give you some really good basics on what to consider, what to look for, maybe even kind of some homework projects for you next time you look at quilts, or even just going through images on the computer and you say, oh, I love that quilt. Well, what is it about that quilt that you love? Is it the color combination? Is it the value difference from lights to darks? Is it the textures that are used in the prints? So that will help you kind of start learning, oh, that quilt really piques my interest because, and then you will learn the kind of the terminology, the things to think about when putting together your own quilts. Now, and I started as a quilter. I was actually working in a quilt shop, and I was very tentative about picking color. So my boss did some of the color selection at the beginning when I was doing some shop samples. And I would watch as she would pick out different colors, kind of the interest of, okay, I want to go kind of this direction. And she would keep pulling things out. And I kept thinking, well, that's way too many. Well, it was because she was pulling out ideas and then would step back, kind of absorb what she had and realize, okay, this one's too strong. This one's too light. There's not enough contrast. This is better. So when you go to the quilt shop, you usually kind of have permission to make a mess, which means to pull out as many fabrics that you think might fit into the parameters that you kind of have in your head, and then put back. You can always say no to some of those fabrics. Now, the polite thing, of course, to do is to put back the ones you don't use instead of letting the quilt shop employee have to put all those away. But it is a way to practice, because within our own stashes of fabric, we probably have things we like, things we've used, but we may not have all the things in between, the shades and the tints that are needed, or the contrasts. Because, if I'm making a quilt and it really probably requires a little bit of orange or yellow, I might not have very much of it because they're not my favorite colors. But there are times when that just a tiny bit of a variation of an orange will be the perfect contrast for your quilt. So the quilt shop, or any store that carries a selection of color will be your best resource. Go in and play with those fabrics a little until you find the right combination. So it's all about the shopping. Isn't that perfect, Leah?
Start. I want to draw everyone's attention again to the chat box. I do see some people saying hello and where they're viewing from. Eric, I see that you have a question for Colleen. Now is your time to go ahead and put that question in the chat box, and I will ask it to her as soon as that comes in. And we also have a comment coming in from Vi. Vi looks to have been a sewer for most of her creative life, but just recently developed an interest in quilting. She says, I need all the help I can get. So, Colleen, I'm going to have you start out. If we have somebody coming from the sewing world into the quilting world, what skills kind of transfer and what could people focus on when they're doing that change over into quilting?
Exactly. And I am with you because I was a transfer from the garment sewing realm into quilting. So I know exactly where you're at. It looks daunting because in garment sewing, we probably are using one or two fabrics, and we can coordinate one or two fabrics, but the color, it's the part that's going to take a little bit getting used to adding pieces and values and tints in there. The other portion that you're going to have to do a little bit of adapting is that here's the checklist. You got a pencil and paper. Let's go. You need to make sure you know what a 1/4 inch seam looks like on your sewing machine, because I thought I did, but mine was more like a 3/8 of an inch. So make sure it's like an accurate 1/4 inch seam. The next thing is set your stitch length shorter than in piecing. On my machine, it goes to a 2.5. On one of it goes to 2.0. So shorter stitch length, more stitches per inch. Because we aren't going to, number 3, we aren't going to back stitch anymore. In garment sewing, as we begin a seam, we tend to back stitch to reinforce that beginning. And as we get to the end of a seam, we back stitch again, just a couple stitches to reinforce. That's because those stitches are a little bit longer. And when we start to join pieces together, if we tug on it, we might pop a stitch or two. In quilting, if we have those longer stitches and we're only using a 1/4 inch seam allowance and we pop a stitch or two, we would be getting, into the actual piecing, the part that's going to be revealed. So a shorter stitch length is what you need to set your machine at. So we've got an accurate 1/4 inch seam. We've got a shorter stitch length. Try not to backstitch anymore. If your machine has like a reinforced stitch where it takes 2 little stitches in a row right on top of each other, you could use that in some instances, but in most piecing, you will no longer need a backstitch. Let's see, what's the other things? Some of the other things you're going to need to kind of put into your wheelhouse. You are used to probably pressing from the back side of the fabric. So from the side with the seams, and you're used to pressing your seam allowances open. In quilting, most generally, we press seam allowances to one side. And if there are 2 fabrics joined together, the lighter and the darker of those 2, we tend to press those seam allowances together toward the darker of the 2 fabrics. So pressing will be done from the top, from the right side, and pushing the seam allowance toward the darker fabric. Now remember not to iron like we do when we have a wrinkled shirt. Remember to press down and use a very hot iron. So those are all kind of the ironing, pressing kinds of things that we need to consider. Let's see, what are some other things that when you're measuring and cutting? Now when in the garment area, we tend to cut around a pattern shape, close counts. But in quilting, since we only have a 1/4 inch seam, accuracy is going to become kind of your best friend. So talk to quilters If you don't have somebody close by, go to a local quilt shop. Look at different tools that are out there for cutting. I have one within arm's reach here. The acrylic rulers that you're going to need, and a rotary cutter. There are 3 sizes of these available. This is the 45 millimeter. This is about the average that most people will use. There is a 33 smaller and a 60 that's very large. This is probably the most common one sold on the market. as in size. They come in all kinds of fun colors of handles and styles. So try some of those out at your local quilt shop. As for acrylic rulers, if I were to buy just 3 rulers at the beginning, I would pick and this seems very large, but you will use it, I promise, an 8.5 by 24.5 ruler. So it's it's a wide, narrow ruler that will reach across the width of fabric. Another one I would purchase would be a 12.5 square and then a 6.5 square. Those 3 shapes of rulers will get you a long ways down the road before you have to add any more into your toolbox. You can pick up others as you go along, but those will cover a lot of the shapes that you're going to be cutting and working with in the beginning stages of your quilting. Also buy a cutting mat that is at least, and this is hard because these are kind of expensive. You can find different grades of them, but something that's at least 18.5 by 24, or somewhere in there, so that you can go the width of fabric at least one direction, with the fabric folded, to be correct there. So it'd be about 22 inches. You need at least a 24-inch mat in one direction so that you can do those quick strokes across cutting strips, because eventually you will cut a lot of strips in your quilting journey. So those are some of the really basic tools you need, some of the really simple things you need to adjust in your piecing so that you can really advance quickly, because you have the command of your machine. You are a seamstress. You know how that machine works. You know where the buttons are already. You've got that hurdle already well accomplished. So just get the smaller things like that small 1/4-inch seam, your stitch length proper, your pressing, and some accurate cutting tools, and you are going to be a fabulous quilter.
On the beginning end of quilting for this next question, it comes in from Eric, and it is pretty general. So Colleen, I'm going to ask it to you, and then I'm going to add a little specific point that I'd like you to highlight as well, because I know we've got these tools. So Eric wants to know, is quilting very easy or very hard to learn? So before you speak on that, I also want to make sure that you let our viewers, and not just Eric, know if you are new to quilting, where can you find more of Colleen or more content for beginners? Because I know it's out there and I want to make sure you have access to it. So go ahead, Colleen.
Okay. Quilting for everyone, it's different for everyone. Some people find sitting down and putting small pieces of fabric together very relaxing, almost mesmerizing. They enjoy the process, the sound of the machine, the creative process. They get started on putting 2 pieces together, and pretty soon they're like, I can't stop until I have a block created because I want to see what it's going to look like. And so they can kind of get lost in the process and just enjoy the color, the feel of the fabric, the sound of the machine. For other people, it tends to be a little bit more work. So it depends on your temperament. It depends on your that desire to learn the skill, I guess, is what it comes down to. It's just another outlet, similar to painting or woodworking. There's that creative part in you that wants to come out, and if it comes out in fabric, you are a quilter. So the piecing, now to be totally honest, the piecing portion of quilting for the majority of quilters is an easy to acquire skill. When it comes to the quilting part, the actual layering the pieces together and sandwiching it to quilt through it and then finish with the binding sometimes takes us longer than we like. It's been said many times that our piecing skills advance quickly and we become a graduate student in piecing, while our machine quilting may lag and we kind of stay in the kindergarten zone or the intermediate zone for quite a while. That's why there are long arm quilters out there. There are people who will help you finish your quilt. Just because, well, I shouldn't say this. Some people like to finish the quilt themselves, and that is totally acceptable. Others, they love the piecing part. They don't appreciate the quilting part, and they partner with someone to help them finish their quilt. And that is totally acceptable also. So it just depends on your mindset, what your goal, where your heart's desire falls. So you will find quilting at different stages to be easy, more difficult possibly, and then fun in the finish maybe at the very end. I love to put binding on. I love to do the hand finishing. Others absolutely hate it. So you will fall somewhere in the middle probably. Now, in order to learn more techniques and learn more skills, National Quilters Circle does have a plethora of videos that will help you with different skills, different techniques, different tools out there. So if you'd like to view more of those, you can look in the list of things that we have and find something that, oh, I want to work on. I want to learn how to make a quilt label. I want to learn more about pressing skills. Those are all out there in the realm of National Quilter Circle. We're here to help you.
Like Eric and has questions, our tech team working behind the scenes did drop a link into the chat box, and it is the Ask the Expert link. So if you are having some questions and you would like to ask an expert, not necessarily having access to a live Q&A at the moment, that link will get you to a contact page where you can send your questions in as well. So if you don't get your question answered today, or you just want to come back another time and have that question, check out that link. That's going to be an excellent tool for you as well. Let's move into a color question, a little bit on theme for the PDF download that we talked about at the beginning. This one comes in from Lisa. And Lisa's asking, well, I am stuck with my colors. Everything I do is purple. I have a hard time differentiating between light, medium, and dark. So, Colleen, do you have any tips on making that differentiation?
Most definitely. And you probably have it in your pocket. Your cell phone. If you take a picture of the fabrics that you have selected for a project and you want to know, do I have light, medium, and dark included in my project, take a photo, go into edit, and change it to black and white. It used to be that we had to use, a red filter glasses or some kind of a device to look through to see the filter to get it to grayscale. But we have it all in our pockets now. So our cell phone in the photos, if you go into the edit or changing things there, you can go and slide it all the way to grayscale. And that will tell you, I have all these lights and maybe a couple of mediums and one dark. Well, that poor dark fabric is going to be kind of a hole in your quilt. He is going to catch the eye because he's going to be all by himself in those spots. So, or you may find you have very little light, very little dark, and you have a lot of medium in the middle, which will make your piecing less distinct. Now, there are times when you want a soft contrast quilt, and that is totally acceptable. But if you're unhappy with how things are going and you're not seeing, like, I did all this work and I can't even see the points that I put on this star, that might mean that you have too many mediums or too much of one value in your quilt. So by using that grayscale on your phone, you can come up with that, like, oh, everything's falling a little too far to one end of the spectrum or the other. The other option would be, if you don't have a cell phone, it would be to take your swatches and put them into a printer and copy them as gray there in grayscale. The same thing will happen. It will show you, do I have too many lights and no medium, or no lights and darks at all? Somewhere in there, you're probably missing some of those points. So you need to include those in your grouping. Now, if you get stuck in one color too often, it's probably because that's what you love, and that's okay. But if you realize that and you want to push beyond that color that you tend to fall into, find a version of that color. Like if you love purples, go more into magenta, into reds. Go more, maybe try going into periwinkles, into blue purples. So stretch just a little further out into that color scheme and see what happens. That, you can always give the quilt away. You don't have to love everything you make. Not every artist falls in love with their finished product. There are times when you think, I don't know what I was thinking. And that happens to all of us. So you are in definitely good company there. But sometimes it's a stretch, and do those, maybe try those on smaller projects. If you don't want to invest a lot of, money and time going into another color range that you're not so comfortable, do something small. Do a table runner, do a smaller wall hanging, do some placemats. that will give you a place to play without a huge investment. And you may find that, wow, I kind of like those colors together. So try those things.
I wonder if that last tip will be useful for our next viewer with a question. This is coming in from Carolyn. Carolyn says that I've seen quilt blocks that I just didn't care for, no matter what, so sure that I never would. Then after years, I see it used and I find it amazing. So it has to be the colors. What do you think about that, Colleen? Is that something a smaller project, testing out some colors, might help with?
Yes, exactly. And sometimes it's the color and sometimes it's the arrangement or the color where the colors are placed within that block. Now, you might have picked something, say for Halloween. So purple, orange, and green, this kind of traditional Halloween kind of, festive colors. It might be that the placement wasn't right. The dominance wasn't right in the block itself. So if you finish a block and you go, I don't know, and I just don't want to use it, try one more block, but move the colors around and see if it does something different. Because the way patterns, a lot of quilt blocks, not all, have some symmetry in them. And there's kind of a depth that we create with a background block and then possibly a reoccurring triangle or square within it, and then kind of a secondary color that maybe gives a shadow effect to it. So maybe it was just the color placement that you didn't like. Try it and give it just one more try and see. There are times, and a friend and I were talking about this too. We both like a turn dash block, but we don't like a turn dash block on point. And that all that is instead of it being put into the quilt square, it's put on its tip. And there's something about just that change in the angle. It creates something different when we first look at it. It seems silly, but sometimes that's the difference too of how it's used in the finished block or project.
With a pattern before years go by.
Exactly.
All right, let's go to our next question here. I believe I'm saying your name correctly. I'm sorry if I'm getting it wrong, but Tatame is asking, they've been making story quilts for about 2 years now. And Colleen, they want to know, do you have tips for hand sewing applique? I feel like I'm so slow still.
Applique is a patience and endurance kind of journey. That's all there is to it when it comes to applique. Enjoy the process. Because you're slow, you think you're slow at it, doesn't mean you actually are. Just enjoy the process. A lot of us kind of get into this hurry up and be done kind of mentality and sometimes miss the joy of actually making the blocks. So in the process of applique, I think there is something meditative and rhythmic about doing applique. One thing to think of, and you probably already are doing this because I tend to get too long of a strand of thread when our length of thread when I'm doing an applique or even doing binding. And then I tend to get a little nest of threads and I'm constantly picking out a knot somewhere along the line. And if you're doing that, that's where maybe you're getting a hiccup in your timing. So go to a little bit shorter length of thread. You'll have a smoother time of doing it, but just enjoy the process, the rhythm and the repetition and the creative process. I don't think it's a race to the finish. I think it's enjoy the process.
You finished that answer talking about thread, Colleen, so I'm going to go to Carrie's question next. Carrie is asking specifically about the kind of thread that you can use. Is quilting always done with cotton thread or is polyester thread okay?
Good question. Very good question. Traditionalists will tell you they're 100% cotton, 100% cotton thread, 100% cotton fabric, 100% cotton batting, 100% cotton as the backing. That is if you want your quilt to last 150 to 200 years. Most of the quilts I make to be used. They are not heirloom quilts. Their life expectancy may be shorter than 100 years. If it's given to one of my grandkids, it might be a lot shorter. But there are a lot of good polyester threads, poly cotton threads on the market. And I tend to use a combination of cotton sometimes, cotton polyesters at other times. So I would say buy good quality thread, and also a thread that your sewing machine likes. Not every sewing machine is created equal. I used to think that that was a silly thought, but most of my sewing machines don't seem to have an issue with one kind of thread versus another. But I have a friend who has one of the same sewing machines as one of my others, not this one, but another. Every quilter has more than one sewing machine, correct? Um, and mine will take just about any kind of thread. Hers, it's only one or two brands, and it doesn't like the others. And we have every sewing tech has looked at it and said, I have no idea why. So the answer to the question is the thread that your machine likes, and the best thread, quality thread that you can afford. So that's my answer, and I'm sticking with it.
Carrie, I hope that helps as you're choosing your threads for your next projects. Shirley's got a good question here. Shirley's wanting to do a quilt that I have the pattern to, but the color mixture is no longer available as it was when the pattern first came out. So I can't imagine it in another color. Colleen, do you have suggestions for that scenario?
Yeah, that's going to be some shopping trips, and maybe some searching online. When pattern creators make their sample, it's on the cover of their pattern. They select fabrics of things that they like, and they picture that, and that's the cover of their quilt pattern. Colors do change, just like fashion colors in clothing changes. Colors within our homes change. There's trends, and as one comes in, another goes out. Finding fabrics to replicate something that maybe no longer is up, it's going to be a task and a half. There are some shops that carry fabrics a long time. So you may find something similar, but go to a reputable quilt shop and ask for someone there who's good with color and fabrics, who knows the shop well, especially a fabric shop that has a lot of bolts of fabric. And you may find something comparable. It may cross from another genre you hadn't thought of before, but usually it's possible to get fairly close to what was originally in the picture that you fell in love with. But also be open to the possibility that maybe there's another combination out there you will fall in love with also. So it's time to go shopping.
All right, we have a couple questions coming in about rulers next. I'll start with Evie's. Evie asks Colleen if you have any preference on the brand of rulers. Any size, what brand preference do you have?
Okay. So if I could go back and I could select all brand new rulers, I'd have to have a new bank account. But if I was selecting brand new today, I would probably tend to go towards Quilters Select. They are a brand of ruler that has a very light coating on the back, but it makes it not slip when you're cutting. And the ease of using those rulers is absolutely phenomenal. It will save on your wrist, your elbow, on your fingers, everything. You barely have to put any pressure on it, and the ruler does not skid out of the way. We've taught techniques for years on how to place your fingers across the ruler, then walk your hand up it so that as you're putting pressure along the edge you're cutting, it doesn't slide and glide out of the way on you and make it an irregular cut. Quilter Select has engineered a really great coating for the back of their rulers, and I didn't think I was going to be a lover of a certain brand of ruler, but they work. And that coating lasts a very, very long time. It will wear off, but considering that I was using them in a shop where it was like industrial use, and we had been using them for more than 2 or 3 years, and they still worked great, I'd say I think those are good brands. Now, other brands that you may not have Quilter Select near you, or maybe they're a little pricier than what you want to go into. Creative Grids is a good company. They have kind of grippers on the back side of their rulers. Those are black and white. So this is something else to think about, is the color of the ruler. Different brands have different colors of markings, and everyone's eyesight's a little bit different. So if a yellow marking on a ruler bothers you, go to one that has a black and white marking. There is even, I think, a brand out there that has orange markings, and some have like high vis yellow. So see what works best for your eyesight also, because as I get older, I realize that becomes a concern and something to think about when buying rulers, that make it easy for our eye to pick up those increments, those areas that we need to be, looking at when we're making nice, perfect cuts for our piecing. So the texture to the back side of the ruler is important. So Quilter Select is a good one. Creative Grids has a grip method on the back of theirs. If you are maybe buying secondhand or something else out there, there are products for you to add to, grippers or dots that you can add to the back side of rulers to help you with accuracy too. So take all those things into consideration. I mean, it's an investment because they're tools you're going to use over and over and over again. So, purchase the best quality, again, the best quality you can afford and you're comfortable with and works good for you.
All right, so I think that you may have already given our next viewer a little tip to start with, but in the event that getting a new brand of ruler isn't exactly available, Andrea's got a question about having difficulty getting my strips to be evenly cut. No matter what I do, the ruler seems to move before I finish cutting. So if you have any non-brand tips, Colleen, that people can do, I'm sure Andrea would appreciate those.
Yep. There are at least 3 or 4 different, probably more than that, probably a dozen different kinds of products you can find out there. There are some that are like a kind of a sticky dot or a rubberized dot that can go on the backside of rulers. There are ones that are like little sandpaper dots that can go on the backside of rulers. There is a film that can go to the backside of a ruler. I think it's called True Grip or something similar to that, that you can apply to help it from slipping. What was it? Oh, there's one other that's a spray that makes it slightly, not very, slightly tacky on the backside of your ruler. It's called Grip It, I think, or Grippy. You have to Google that and figure out which one it is. But there is a spray kind of thing that you can put. You will have to reapply it over time, but it makes it slightly tacky. Not as tacky as, say, a Post-it note or self-adhesive Post-it. But it gives it just a little bit of tackiness so you don't get that drifting, because that can be the arch nemesis of getting accurate piecing, is getting that cutting. It can also just be a practice of how to walk your hand across a ruler, and where, you're cutting, say, along an edge here, dropping your pinky off the edge can help stabilize the ruler, and then walking your way up the ruler as you get further away from your body as you cut. It comes with practice, and sometimes you just need those extra little like adhesive things on the bottom side of your ruler to give you some training wheels till you get used to that. So you can do it. Just find a product. And a lot of local quilt shops, you can Google for products like that. They're fairly inexpensive. They will give you some help along the way.
All right, good luck keeping your ruler in place, Andrea. Ooh, Katie is looking ahead to Christmas here with our next question. So Katie asks, what has been your favorite Christmas quilt that you've made? I know it's early, but it's never too early to get started.
Oh, man, that's hard, because I've made, when you've been in the quilt world a while, you kind of, you think, oh, I need a new Christmas quilt. Let's see. Because I have made Christmas quilt that had applique, like football shapes, a kind of a, that was applique on top, that I really, really loved. And I can see it from here. I just can't get it here with my microphone on. I've made a twister one recently. I made one for my daughter and one for myself, so we both have new Christmas quilts. One that she used to steal all the time when she was in college was a flannel quilt that was more of a modern, and it was done from a turning 20, I think. It was a very simple pattern, but it had more modern colors instead of traditional Christmas green. It had more like the teals and kind of pinkish red in it. And she used to steal that one all the time. What other Christmas? Oh, I did a Christmas retreat quilt. Trying to think if it was medallion style or row quilt. I can't remember now. I think it was medallion style. And I really enjoyed that one. It's hard because I have tried out so many different kinds of patterns. I like to dabble. I don't like to repeat one technique over and over. So, like a medallion quilt, starting in the center and adding rows of different kinds of piecing around was one version. One was applique with the football shapes that kind of made kind of almost like a Christmas poinsettia feel to it, but more of a flowery shape. But that was applique. The turning 20 was using fat quarters to make a really quick project because I liked the idea of getting something done quick and using up all of the fabric within those fat quarters. So that was, another technique I've done. I'm trying to think. I know there are other Christmas quilts that I've created. I just can't think of the techniques that I used in them. But I would say go find a technique you haven't tried before, and maybe one that doesn't take too much time, because Christmas does kind of come and go fairly quickly. But it's a fun way to try out a new technique, and that you can take out in every Christmas. Remember, yeah, that's when I tried doing, a set-in seam, or I tried doing, friendship stars or something like that. So, or a row quilt like the one behind me. If you like 5 or 6 different blocks and you really want to have fun playing with an entire collection of Christmas fabrics that maybe you have, you can create rows of blocks like in this quilt so that you can kind of mix up all of your Christmas fabrics. I know my mother-in-law made me a Christmas project, and she collected Christmas fabrics for years. And it's more of a crazy quilt kind of thing. And it just has a montage of every Christmas print you can think of. And it's a fabulous story because she can remember, oh, I bought this here, I bought that there. So there's a lot of ways approaching that Christmas quilt, but I would say start now because it is almost September and Christmas fabric will start to disappear in the quilt shops. Do not wait until November. Last year, I remember somebody coming in and asking, so where are the Christmas fabrics? And it was, 2 weeks before Thanksgiving. And we didn't have very much Christmas fabric left. I'm like, oh, honey, it comes in July. You have to start early. So go get your Christmas fabrics out, find a fun little pattern, and start cutting.
Okay, before I ask our next question, there's a few commenters here in the chat box going back to holding the ruler steady. If you have hand weights at home, which maybe some of us have acquired some hand weights for working out at home in the past 18 months or so, you can grab one of those and place it on your ruler to help hold it in place. So it's a little multi-purpose, multifunctional. A couple people have mentioned they use those.
Very good.
All right, Caitlin, I want to go to your question next, Caitlin. I'm going to ask it the way that it's typed, but I'm wondering if there's a typo in here, so you can clarify for me. So Caitlin is asking, what are your thoughts on using circuit to cut fabric? And I'm wondering if that means the Cricut.
Yep, I would say so. The Cricut can be very helpful. If cutting is your arch nemesis, a Cricut, or there are fabric cutting tools out there. I think that the Cricut works for fabric also. I'm not absolutely sure because I don't own one of those systems, but I know that there are cutting systems out there for die cutting fabrics, and they create perfectly accurate pieces over and over. So if cutting is your hiccup that keeps you away from the sewing machine, go get one. Or find a friend that has one, or go buy one with a quilt friend and share it between the 2 of you or 3 of you or however many in your quilt guild or your small group. They will help you in creating very accurate pieces and in a very, very short amount of time. Very good.
All right, let's go to, again, I'm going to try to say this correctly, Gebel. Gebel asks, when quilting, Are there definite paths to follow? So, for example, stitch in the ditch first, then doing flower patterns in the blocks, or do you do the flower pattern first and then stitch in the ditch?
Okay, that's a really good question, because when we start to do the machine quilting process of putting the layers that sandwich together and stitching through everything, generally machine quilters will tell you put the bones in the quilt first. And I'm taking that from a quilter that I've known for a long time, a long armor who's very, very accomplished. The idea is that the stitch in the ditch is kind of like putting the skeleton structure into the quilt. It helps hold everything in place so that when you go in to do those more elaborate, maybe free motion kinds of stitching, in different areas, that you don't get a shift. So by putting those in, you will keep straight lines, kind of the structure to what you're working on. Say you have blocks that have flying geese in them, that so you have triangles in there, and you've linked these blocks together with sashing. Now, sashing is meant to be that straight line, kind of like window pane between the blocks. And if you were to start sewing or quilting in this block and then skip over here and then over here, you may get a shift of that sashing. So what you want to do is stitch on either side of that sashing first to kind of lock it down, create that framework that then you go back into the quilting within the block itself. Now, also remember to always start toward the center of your quilt and work your way outward, because if you start at one side and work all the way across, you're going to get, even with a walking foot or a dual feed foot, you're going to get a tiny bit of shift as you work all the way across that quilt. And if you work from the center out, you will get less, because of course you're going only half the distance now. So that means you have half the less chance of having a shift in that overall top. So go in and put in those in the ditch areas, give your quilt top some structure, some bones, a skeleton to hold it together, and then go back and fill in and do your creative, elaborate, or even simple outlining or whatever you're going to put into your blocks. Even if it's ruler work, it will help keep things nice and squared up, and you get an overall more of an alignment. Because there's always those times when you've outlined a few and they didn't, and then later it's like it's off by like just enough so that your eye sees there's a jump, and you're like, oh, I shouldn't have done that. And nobody wants to take all of that quilting out. So bones first, and then put in the pretty.
All right, thank you. That was really helpful advice on that one, Colleen. Beth has our next question, and Beth wants to know, what about mixing types of fabric in one quilt? So mixing cotton and cotton poly blends. What do you have to say about that, Colleen?
If you're going to go cotton poly, I might say don't do that. Now, I did say cotton poly thread. Yes, I did say that. Thread's a little bit different situation because that's within the seams. But when we're talking about the entire surface of the quilt now with cotton and cotton poly, we have a big difference in the shrinkability rate of these two. And one is going to pull away from the other and may cause seams to actually split or pop, because there's going to be a drawing process in the washing and drying of cotton versus a cotton polyester. So I would, at this point, go back to a traditionalist view that everything in the quilt top ought to be 100% cotton. Now, the one caveat I'm going to put in there is if you're making a t-shirt quilt or a memory quilt, those are their own category. They probably aren't going to be washed repeatedly. T-shirts have been washed repeatedly already, so their shrinkage is done. And in memory quilts, it's not something that's probably, in most cases, probably 95 to 99%, those quilts are memory quilts that are going to be held in a little different esteem. They're not going to be thrown on the floor. They're not going to be used for a picnic. They're not going to be used to make a grandkid's tent out of, but those are going to be held in a special place within the home probably. So in those cases, you can use variable fabrics, or if it's a wall hanging that's not going to be washed. I've seen silks, taffetas, velvets, velveteens, all those things included in wall art quilt things that are not going to be laundered. They may be vacuumed off or dusted off, but that's okay for those. We're talking about bed quilts, things that are going to be used, lap quilts, baby quilts. Keep in the 100% cotton there so that everything has that same shrinkage rate, so that the wear on those lasts at least as long until the child grows to the next stage, or that quilt is worn out so you can give another one.
All right, I really enjoy having the reasoning behind that particular answer. So I hope that's really helpful for anybody viewing and having the same question about mixing those fabric
Straight.
types.
Yep.
Let's go to Alice's question next. Alice wants to know, Colleen, if you have a favorite cutting mat, and how do you know when it is time to replace your mat?
Let's see. I probably own 3 or 4 different brands of mats, and I don't really know if I have a favorite. My favorite mat is the one that's where it needs to be when I need to cut. So I have used Fisker mats, I've used Olfa, I've used June Taylor. Trying to remember, there's a couple other brands in there, I think, even that I have used over the years. They all seem to work fairly the same. The only one that I kind of shied away from, and it was the very first mat, and I was given it as a gift, so I used it till there wasn't anything left of it. It was a light milky colored mat, and eventually it wasn't what they called a self-healing mat. It started to slice little pieces of plastic out of it, and so it went away. It was used for crafting and things like that to protect a surface. Most of the other mats that are sold in your local quilt shops or even online, most of them work fairly similarly. So I can't really say that I have a favorite brand of mat. My biggest thing is having a big mat. I mean, my first mat was fairly small. I was constantly shifting directions so that I could get with the fabric cut on the fold to get it in the right spot. And it drove me kind of crazy after a while. I was always just twirling around to get in the right position. And once I bought a mat that was 24 by 36, it was like heaven. I could leave it lay there. I could cut from either direction. It was just, it sufficed all the time, because the things that slow you down are the little things, like having to reposition a mat just to cut a couple of strips of fabric. And if you have a mat that's just always ready to go, that's the mat that you want. So I realize that mats are expensive. And so if it has to be through a coupon, or it has to be through a wish list from Santa or some other way, or if your children really love you, say, I want a gift certificate to this quilt shop and I will take nothing else. Show the love, get that gift card, and go get that mat that you want, that covers the surface, protects your sewing area or your cutting area, and that you don't have to take the time to keep moving around. So I think that is more, my favorite thing is more about the size of the mat, not the brand of the mat.
All right, well, hopefully that's helpful if you're selecting or dropping some hints for upcoming holiday gifts.
Exactly. Come on, Santa.
Okay, we have time here for a few more questions. I'll get to as many as possible. We're going to do Anthony's next. And Anthony wants to know, when you're planning a new quilt, Colleen, do you generally plan the same size for all of your quilts?
Oh, no. The sky's the limit. The size of the quilt is really determined by its use. So when I'm planning a quilt for my newest grandkid, it's going to be something fairly small that can be used to take them in and out of the car. Of course, blankets aren't used in baby beds anymore. So it's going to be a quilt that can be laid on the floor, that they can have, their tummy time and roll around on the floor. It's going to be that one that they're going to throw over their head as they're taking them in and out of the car here in the Midwest in the winter when it's freezing cold. So then, it goes on to the other things. Is it a gift for somebody who really wouldn't use it as a bed quilt, but would love to have that quilt to curl up with to watch movies or to watch TV? So a lap quilt, so it's going to be a little smaller. Is it going to be a quilt that's going to be given to someone in a nursing home and they spend time in a wheelchair And a lap quilt that can be tucked and not drag onto the floor and get caught into wheels, that will really determine the size of the quilt that you create there. Is it as a wedding gift that you want to be as a bed quilt? So that really determines it's usually what I choose first. Okay, well, how big do I want to make a quilt? Then I go looking for a pattern that will fit into that parameter or is available in different sizes. A well-written quilt. A lot of times you turn that pattern over, you'll see that, pictured is the lap quilt, but here's the yardage for a full size and a queen size and a king size. And do I still like, like you should tend to put thumbnails, do I still like that pattern if it gets bigger and bigger? So that's kind of how I approach it, is the use of the quilt will then determine the size, and then go find a pattern that fits the scale of the use and has maybe the right number of fabrics within it. If you want to use a wide variety of fabrics, then you need to find a pattern that you can use a lot of colors in too. So there's a lot of things to take into consideration as you plan a new project.
Oh, I feel like I can tie that into our next question here from Sandy a little bit. Sandy has discovered the beauty of quilting with collections that already have put great colors together. And I now have several orphan FQs. Do you have a favorite scrap quilt pattern?
Aha. Those fat quarters that get put off to the side. When you have a collection, you buy a collection of fat quarters and you cherry pick out the ones you want for your project. And there's always those orphans that seem to pop up, and sometimes it's like, oh, they're not my favorites anyway. Well, those might be for trading off with a quilt friend who really does like that color, or it's put into like a kind of a fat quarter friendly kind of project. So I would probably start to look through patterns that are called fat quarter friendly. That I know is kind of a terminology that there are different quilters that have used that, or pre-cut friendly patterns. If you consider a fat quarter a pre-cut, so that you use it up efficiently. The idea is try not to have any pieces of scraps left over if you're one of those kinds of quilters. So there are those kinds of patterns out there that will efficiently cut pieces, and they'll give you diagrams on how to cut up that fat quarter so that you use the entire thing, or at least most of it. And those are really fabulous patterns to run across. So if you can put some of those into your kind of stash of when you go shopping or when you're looking at patterns, look for those that are, friendly to being used with fat quarters, so that you have like, 4 or 5 of your favorites, so that when you accumulate enough of those orphan fat quarters, that you can easily then work those into those patterns. Sometimes our orphans tend to be kind of lights that were like, there's more light in here than I wanted, or too many darks. But remember that when we're talking about color and balance, that you need lights, mediums, and darks, and a variety of texture. So if you've collected a lot of fat quarters of a lot of lights, maybe that's the background for another quilt that maybe only has one color in it, but all these lights now become the background of the color of your quilt. So there are many, many ways to use them up. You just kind of have to think about them, because you're limited on how much yardage you have, and you have to kind of be able to let go and add other pieces and say that's okay, instead of having like maybe all one color or one fabric be your background. So something to practice.
Good luck with using up all of those extra scraps for sure. Oh, good. We do have time, I believe, for 2 more questions. So we'll do Janine's next. Colleen, have you used Martelli palm quilting paddles? And if so, do you have an opinion on the product?
I have used similar ones for a few practice things. Everybody has different tools in machine quilting that they like. And some people love the paddles, things that you can lay onto your quilt sandwich and maneuver your quilt under the needle of your domestic machine. Everybody has different opinions on them. So because I came to quilting, I think maybe even before I knew that those were on the market, I went toward quilting gloves instead, that have a texture on the tips of the fingers or on the interior of the hands. So I tend to use those. For me, it's a personal thing. I think it's because when I have to grip something and push down at the same time, it's a little bit more stress on my hands and on my wrists. And by using the gloves, I feel like I can just kind of gently get a grip on my fabric and move it. So I would say if you can test them before you actually purchase them, or if you know someone who has them, you could test theirs, I would try that. And for some people, they work beautifully. I have seen people sit down and use those, and I'm like, why can't I do that? And maybe it comes with more practice. And they may be able to give you more tips on their site on using them. I would look to see if they have some additional video and tips on using those. But if you've tried other techniques and other little tools and aids, and you haven't found those helpful, try them, because it might be the ticket that helps you create the quilting that you want in your quilt. It's just that we're all made differently. And so even though we all have 2 hands and 10 fingers, they all kind of work differently sometimes.
All right, so try it out and see how you like it. And of course, you can always crowdsource this in the comment section. So if anybody has any experience and you want to share your opinion, you can drop that in the comment box as well. We're going to go to our last question today. It's from Dory. Dory is asking, how about paper piecing? Is this a good technique for beginners? What are your thoughts?
Paper piecing is fun, at least most of the time. There are times at the very beginning that you will cut your pieces too small, and you'll be like, oh, I should have just left that as a big chunk. Paper piecing is very different than traditional piecing. Now, when we are cutting out specific shapes and piecing those together with a 1/4-inch seam, there's an accuracy thing there to create the engineered block in the end to get it to the right size. In paper foundation piecing, which I believe is the style of paper piecing you're talking about, we aren't as worried maybe as about the cutting of exact sizes of pieces, because the foundation, we will get general sizes hopefully with your pattern, or you will have to figure out the amount of fabric to cover a specific area, because the pattern is drawn out on a piece of paper. You make a copy of that, because we usually want to reserve our original, or if it comes with multiple copies of it. And you're going to do a fold and stitch kind of method where you're building the quilt block on the underside and you're stitching on the paper side. The nice part about this for beginners is that your stitching is right on the drawn line. So you don't have to worry about where your 1/4-inch seam, if it's accurate, if it's just right or not, because that stitching is now dot to dot from one end of the line to the other, and you're following right along that line. It does take a bit of a learning curve at the beginning to get figured out how to do it. So there are some really great videos, and I believe that I don't know if Ashley or somebody had done, I'm sure they'll probably put a link to one or two of the videos about paper foundation piecing into the chat here. A project that I did, maybe late January or sometime in February, had just a little taste of paper foundation piecing in it when we were working on a cord keeper bag. So if you want to go see that free video, you could see a taste of paper foundation piecing there. But once you get the hang of it, it's fun, because the shapes of the pieces, yes, you do need to make sure you always cut large enough to cover the area, but you get to play with angles and shapes that you would never, ever be able to cut with a rotary cutter and ruler, because you can do these really, eventually, when you get into more extensive paper foundation piecing, you can do a slight curve by adding just little slivers of fabric at a time. And there is kind of an elegance and curve that goes with that kind of paper piecing that is almost impossible for us to create in the traditional piecing realm. So it can be very addictive. The very first few pieces that I did were Christmas ornaments that were made into a quilt eventually at a retreat. And my daughter at the time was watching what I was doing and saying, I want to do that. I want to do that. Because the whole 1/4 inch seam, yet she was young. It frustrated her. And she's like, well, I can sew on a line. And I wanted to show her how to get started. And I kept telling her, always cut your pieces big enough. But she is like me. She shooed me out of the room and came back upstairs later and said, look, I did it. Don't look at the ones I didn't do so good on, because she had started over a couple of times. But if a junior high age student can figure it out, you can too. So a little tenacity, generous pieces of fabric, and some patience, and you can create some amazing designs.
All right, well, Colleen, before I let our viewers go with a few reminders, do you have any final thoughts that you want to share? We've reached the end of our hour, so now would be the time.
Remember that quilting is a journey. It's not a race to the end. It's enjoy the process. Every cut, every stitch, every press, every little tiny thing about quilting can become a gift of yourself to someone else.
Oh, wow, that's a really great thought to end on. Thank you so much, Colleen. Now, before I let our viewers go, just a quick reminder that if you haven't already, there is a link to the PDF Quilting Color Theory that is in the chat box, as well as, like Colleen just mentioned, and we talked about a little bit earlier, our team has dropped in a few other links as well to useful tools that we mentioned here in this Q&A. If your question wasn't answered today, hang on to it. There will be more of these, and we very much look forward to seeing you for those. My name is Leah on behalf of the National Quilters Circle, and Colleen, thank you for joining us today. And until then, happy quilting.